Welcome to Navigating Net Zero, where we explore the challenges and opportunities of taking climate action in the real world. Each episode, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with leading climate change professionals and experts for honest conversations about what it means to make net zero a reality. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in.
Well, hi, Liz. Great to see you. And thanks so much for joining me here on this episode of Navigating Net Zero.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
So glad you could join us. I think, as you know, Navigating Net Zero is the place where we have conversations around what's working, what's not, and what's next on the corporate transformation and journey to net zero. And you have been kind of in the trenches on this complicated set of issues for a very long time. Liz Willmott has spent more than 20 years driving climate and sustainability action across the public, nonprofit, and private sectors. At Microsoft, you helped lead the company's carbon negative strategy, including removals and things like sustainable aviation fuel, along with Microsoft's kind of world groundbreaking internal pricing and governance system related to climate change and climate action. You also worked at the federal and municipal levels in leadership roles, and now through your firm Earthrise Consulting, since leaving Microsoft just a year ago or so now, you advise on policy, market standards, and integrity and climate solutions. So, Liz, great to have you here and excited for the conversation.
Thanks. Fantastic. And I have to say, your leadership across sectors has been really fantastic to watch and experience the benefits of.
Well, it's such an opportunity and honor to be able to have these conversations with all the people who I admire the most and really have learned so much from. So would love to just hear a little bit about your previous kind of role and work at Microsoft and what's getting you out of bed these days this morning or in the mornings.
Well, I'll start really with my childhood, which is that my value system as a kid was as a tree hugger who had some close early connections who were conservative. And that really encouraged me to be open-minded. And so my whole life approach has been inherently about understanding and working with a broad set of perspectives and interests. And so as a result of that, I try to bring a growth mindset to every day, to every minute of the day if I can. And it's really actually what helped me transition from climate activism, a small but mighty nonprofit here in the Seattle area, to Microsoft and transition from advocacy into the corporate sector. And so for me, that was an incredibly exciting time. And on the flip side, being so clear about my own internal compass about serving the planet had helped me hold fast to the underlying ethic of Microsoft's carbon strategy.
I think for us all, as we're doing, I'm doing a lot of deep reflection on what's worked and what hasn't worked and where are we winning, where are we losing, what should we be doing differently. And this question of do I go inside the system or stay outside the system, I think is a really big one and an important one, and thinking about how do we leverage both sides of that. So maybe just say a few more words about your decision to go and work inside of a big bureaucratic company as kind of the way in which you felt like you could make the biggest contribution.
When I reflected on that at the time, I really felt it was so important to not villainize the corporate sector and to really understand that the corporate sector, whether we want it to be or not, is the biggest source of power moving change on climate action. And so just practically speaking, we need to be able to harness that movement, harness that momentum, and steer it in a way that's going to help the planet. And what I found when I went to Microsoft in 2016 was really wonderfully surprising, which was that the sincerity and the camaraderie of the mission that I felt not only at Microsoft, but people in other corporations and across political and cultural groups was really, really wonderful. And what I came to realize was that there's a lot of folks who deeply care about living on this planet in a healthy way. And actually that there's a lot of camaraderie and collaboration to be had when we have an attitude of open-mindedness.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about the work you did at Microsoft and maybe what was most surprising to you as you were kind of digging in to what at that point was a fairly well-established but still rapidly evolving strategy.
In 2016, when I arrived at Microsoft, there had already been a leading first-generation carbon program that had started in 2012. They had created Microsoft's then carbon neutral commitment. They had created Microsoft's internal carbon fee. And at the time, because it was hosted in a department that wasn't really central to the power of the organization, they didn't have as many resources as they likely needed to really make a huge impact. And so then ultimately, when Lucas Joppa joined the core central team and became the company's first chief sustainability officer, he really took that agenda and mainstreamed climate science into the consideration of how the company did business, and really elevated the understanding of executives that climate change would be an existential threat to the business of the company, as well as to the business of all of the company's customers. And so that was really the beginning, I think, of where we see Microsoft today and where we see Microsoft's leadership today. And one thing that I'm proudest of, and frankly, a little bit surprised that we were able to do so quickly, was that we as a team, many people, at least 100 people, mainstreamed sustainability into one of the world's largest corporations, bringing it into the financial ledgers, whether it's the carbon fee or executive compensation or the climate innovation fund. And that to me was the most epic and fun thing that we did.
Talk a little bit about the carbon fee and getting that, like, what was the process going into selecting that as kind of the right instrument internally? And obviously, putting a price on carbon is an incredibly important part of mainstreaming these considerations and business as usual practices. And Microsoft decided to do that in a very serious way. And I think that's had significant impact on the company's ability to be very forward-leaning and even-handed in the way in which it's thinking about implementing its strategic objectives related to climate change. So I would love to learn a little more about just that process and how you guys landed on an internal carbon fee and what that looked like.
When the carbon fee was first created in 2012 by my then colleague, TJ DiCaprio, and others, it was really intended as a tool to raise awareness about climate among different executives across the organization and different business groups across the organization. It was also intended as a way to generate funds, internal funds for renewable energy and carbon offsets. But at the time, because of the nature of the program, because of the nature of people's understanding, it was pretty low. And so then fast forward to 2018 and then later, the team decided to raise that carbon fee and to really sharpen its focus on tracking with the cost of carbon abatement. And so then in 2018, we revised it to track with the price of renewable energy so that the organizations inside the company buying renewable energy would just want to do so anyway, want to avoid the fee and just buy the renewable energy anyway. And then ultimately, we use that same paradigm, that same idea to change the carbon fee to charge, essentially incentivize abatement through sustainable aviation fuel and other methods, and continue to help to fund some of these really important solutions that might not otherwise clear the bar financially.
On the methodological side of things, we often struggle when you have a conversation around pricing carbon, like, well, how high should the price be? And what are we benchmarking against? And so as that price was being established and implemented, was it sort of a finger in the wind, like, this seems like this is where we should start? Or were there external places that you looked to try and inform that number?
We looked at the price of carbon projected into the future, carbon removal projected into the future. We looked at the price of sustainable aviation fuel projected into the future, same with renewable energy, and really considered how much funding was needed within the appetite of what the business groups could and were willing to pay, and calibrated based on that, essentially that implicit price of cost of carbon abatement.
I mean, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge fan of marginal abatement cost curves. They just do a really nice job of helping us understand, like, okay, of the mitigation options we have available, here's how they're stacking up price-wise. And that seems like a very sensible way then to sort of come back into the business and say, okay, if you're doing these things and we think we have access to external mitigation options in these price ranges, then we need to kind of make all that math hang together. But that's quite unique. I don't think that's the way that most companies kind of think about this problem. And that's, I think, characteristic of how Microsoft has typically treated its sustainability journey, right? Is that you guys sort of decide this is how we think it should be done and we're going to do it this way. And it tends to be viewed as both credible, but also a little independent from kind of where the rest of the sustainability pack is. Can you just say a few words about kind of, is that intentional part of the strategy, or was it an intentional part of the strategy? And how do you think that's working out now?
I mean, our intention was just to come up with a plan that worked. Yes. And so just super practically, we thought, we know we need to buy more renewable energy. We need to buy more sustainable aviation fuel. We need to reduce our use of these resources. We need to reduce the use of energy. We need to reduce the use of these different fuels. And we need to also fund carbon removal. And so we just said, how much is it going to take? What's going to be the most appropriate internal tool to prompt that? And then we went from there. I didn't personally give too much thought to whether we were being special or unique about this. We just really wanted to get the program funded based on the commitment we had set.
And how was the reception across Microsoft in the other business units and lines? I mean, I think here again, Microsoft is unique in that you have a CEO that's really deeply committed to this set of issues and extremely knowledgeable. How did that show up in the process of rolling out the carbon price and getting folks on board with that?
In the early days before I joined, I would say I think they actually had a council to help set the fee and establish the rules of the road. Now, I think they've resurrected the similar council that has accountability for governance of Microsoft's overall climate strategy. Early days, people were probably curious to potentially questioning or understandably skeptical of any new thing. But I think that now what I experienced was that executives actually embraced it. And some execs even started to gamify it, meaning that they wanted to use the fee to motivate their teams to avoid it. And that's exciting because that was the highest goal that we could have possibly set for ourselves, was that people would really feel it and embrace it and use it.
And I mean, I think that is the power of carbon pricing, right? Is that it really does help people think about this dimension that currently is just kind of left out of all decision making in a formal way, and start to think about it in a more formal way and in a way that enables you to sort of think about the impacts in every business decision that you're making, which of course is what will ultimately be necessary to transition the economy in these companies. But I think getting execs on board and excited about it is, I mean, certainly a challenge that I faced in my previous role, just because for a lot of them, it was so foreign to kind of the things they care about on an everyday basis. And so we talk a lot about the hearts and minds strategy of getting folks on board inside of the company. Tell us a little bit about what that looked like and how that worked.
Well, I really see that with climate in general, and this is true across the roles and across the sectors I've worked in, that the abstract intellectual nature of the problem is super challenging.
Yeah.
Anyone who's worked in climate knows that explaining carbon math or explaining the climate science to someone who may be open to it or maybe warm to act friendly to the cause, but not steeped in the details, it's challenging. And the way we've traditionally approached it as a community is through thinking, analysis, futurism, and all good things, right? All important things. But I think what the carbon fee did in my experience was take all that good thinking and all that analysis and turn it into something galvanizing and towards something hopeful and something that would actually create a new physical, tangible thing in the world by funding a project, like funding a carbon removal project or funding a sustainable aviation fuel project, and really not moving away from something fearful and not villainizing, but rather moving towards something. And so I think that's a microcosm of where we need to go as a climate movement overall. And so to me, the best conversations with executives or elected officials really embrace that idea of moving towards something.
I think that's such an important point. It is a big, scary, huge, abstract problem. And I think we really do struggle to communicate both the impacts and what we do about it. And so getting that really positive, concrete, okay, this is just a number that's on your balance sheet now. And so you need to think about it in your decision making. And also, here's all the cool stuff we're making happen in the world with that money, I think is a really lovely way to sort of show that direct relationship. You and Lucas Joppa, the former CSO of Microsoft, who's now in a senior role at a private equity fund, recently wrote an article in Nature outlining kind of 6 roadblocks to net zero. But you make a lot of really practical suggestions in that article about how to overcome those roadblocks. So tell us a little bit about what those roadblocks are and what you think we can do to address them.
That article to me really captured a lot of simultaneous opportunities and frustrations that I felt after leaving the corporate world. And I think the opportunities were that, I mean, I really see the market development landscape for climate solutions to be, at best, in a good way, a kind of a board game of corporations understanding how the carbon accounting rules work, being able to figure out, not game it in a bad way, but like being able to figure out how to engage in that landscape in a way that advances collective goals of maximizing renewable energy deployment, optimizing sustainable aviation fuel deployment, et cetera.
Yeah.
And right now, the biggest frustration I've had is that the rules of the road have not been clear. The rules of that sort of quote unquote board game have not been clear and have been inflexible. And further, that there's been, I think, an implicit purity test that well-meaning groups and people have held corporate voluntary action to. And so my desire in writing that article, co-writing that article with Lucas, was to say, everyone, we understand this is a really serious issue. And we need to be intellectually flexible and adaptable to what works right now. And we need to be able to prioritize progress from these companies who actually really don't need to do much. I mean, they could be dragging their feet. One of the core roadblocks that we called out was, and actually, I should say, one of the core solution pathways that we see is to prioritize progress over perfection and to really not get caught in the minutia when we really need to be giving tailwinds to these important efforts. And that sort of ethic of giving tailwinds takes shape in all the different frameworks that we use to hold corporations accountable. And I think the task force for climate action transparency that you and others have created is a valuable way to work some of those issues out. I think the devil's always in the details. The climate activist within me says we need to hold the corporations accountable. The 18-year-old in me who was writing letters to paper companies to ask them not to cut down the rainforest back in the 90s was like, we need to hold them accountable. And then this other part of me that also lives in me is like the corporate person who was working so hard to do it and doing the best we could, also realizes that there's ways that we are contributing that are not getting acknowledged.
I so resonate with that too. And I think that's one of the things, that tension is one of the things we're really trying to explore through these conversations, is just how do you hold both of these truths at the same time? Yes, these are incredibly profitable, hugely powerful multinational corporations that have now emissions the size of countries and net worth larger than many countries. And how do you sort of speak that truth to power, but also recognize the very real constraints that companies are facing as they're seeking to decarbonize their operation and take action on climate change? And I think I want to talk for a minute about the role of markets and market-based mechanisms, because I think market-based solutions to climate problems and the necessity of using market-based accounting now today, given the way that the global economy is structured, is one of those areas where we have this big disconnect in the environmental movement that we have to overcome. Because based on my years of work in this space, market-based accounting is a requirement. It's not a nice to have, and it's not an ideological choice. It's just the reality of getting this work done in a capitalist economy with highly global integrated supply chains and economies. And so maybe just from your perspective, Microsoft has obviously been a big proponent of market-based solutions to climate change, and you've helped lead a lot of those kind of front-running initiatives around carbon removal, around sustainable aviation fuels. So talk a little bit about why Microsoft and you personally think that, these instruments are so important, and how we sort of find a way forward.
I really think about this as a good plan is a plan that works.
Mm.
And in 2050, 2030, let's call it even 20, let's just make it 5 years out. In 2030, we need to have far more ubiquitous climate solutions than we have today. Right now, if a corporation wanted to fly its employees on clean, let's call them clean airplanes, they would not necessarily be able to use the molecules of sustainable aviation fuel in the exact planes that the employees are flying in, just because of the nature that the solution set sustainable aviation fuel is not ubiquitous enough. And similar for renewable energy, the electrons are not going into the data centers because they're just not plentiful enough yet. And that's why we need to be able to allow corporations who finance these solutions, who fund these solutions in a meaningful way, of course, in an additional and meaningful way, to be able to get some credit for it in a double ledger format. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be transparent about what their physical, literal emissions actually are, but they should be able to get credit for some of the funding that they're putting toward for these solutions. To me, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that. It's the plan that works and that gets the most money deployed as quickly as possible into things that we know work, and probably some things that might not work, but we think are going to be really important. So I would put a lot of the early stage carbon removal technologies in that latter category, which is we don't know if it's all going to work. And we need to actually get out to develop those technologies and test them out. But that's going to require some way to incentivize companies and other folks to write big checks that they otherwise have no reason to write. And you spend so much time fighting over the color of the bucket that I'm afraid that we're not able to actually get the water deployed on the fire because we can't decide if we want to use a pink or purple bucket. And that to me is just, I think, one of the biggest failings of this space. And you guys in your article emphasized the importance of sort of collaboration and partnership. So talk a little bit about that and how that can help us collectively move through what feels to sometimes like a little bit of an impasse we're at.
Well, collaboration is essential. I mean, we all live on this planet. We all need to be. These corporations all need to be working toward shared goals and all need to start to be purchasing climate solutions. But how are they going to be motivated to do that if the product is not yet superior and the price is not yet superior? And I'm quoting Lucas with that. It's his for sure. And I think that for me, one of the gems of the Microsoft approach, I'm no booster of a particular corporation, but one of the gems of the Microsoft approach is that they are using both the carbon fee to fund the purchases of these new and emerging solutions and their innovation fund as an investment in these early stage solutions to stand the projects up. And I think that we're seeing that across other companies. We're seeing those types of investment funds in other companies. And I think really what it comes down to is having the right legal structures and frameworks to at least remove the barriers to companies to doing that type of work together. And collaboration is really important amongst companies because we all live on this planet and we all need to purchase these climate solutions. The companies need to purchase these climate solutions in the future. And so in order to want to do that, they ultimately have to be, as Lucas would say, price superior and product superior. They have to be actually preferable in the market to existing solutions. And in order to get that started, we need to be able to incentivize the early movers. And the early movers need to be able to work together on such programs as the early days of the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, where companies had to partner to actually make joint advocacy for renewable energy. They had to streamline rules. Again, back to the notion of who gets credit for what. They had to work together to help streamline the rules of carbon accounting and the rules of energy markets. And so really, collaboration is absolutely essential.
I wanted to come back to this example of sustainable aviation fuel because I think it is such a clear and good kind of example of where markets are just not optional. So with sustainable aviation fuel, and Microsoft and Netflix were both inaugural buyers in the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. SABA was started a number of years ago now to really help give some of that market signal for these new products that still cost a lot more than conventional alternatives. To Lucas's point, they have not reached price superiority. I mean, I'm just going for price parity for a lot of these things. And even there, we are years and years away from really being able to touch that, especially because the fossil fuel subsidy system is not looking like it's going anywhere nearly as quickly as we need it to help close the gap between a lot of these newer, cleaner technologies and the incumbent fuels and systems. And so that demand pull of companies working together is really essential to help jumpstart some of these nascent industries. And we saw that with renewable energy, right? With the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, and really helping to get that voluntary action and use that to help front run and pull through some of these new technologies. But maybe just say a few words, because I think you were involved in the early days of Saba and just kind of how that has worked. And there's obviously been replication of that model in a few places. So that's an exciting example, I think, of that collaboration among companies to help accomplish shared objectives around sustainability.
The origin story of Saba, at least from my perspective, or at least the motivation for me in helping to contribute to the sustainable aviation fuel market, is really that we understand companies are going to continue to want to travel for sales and other critical business transactions. And that in order to clean that travel footprint up, we need sustainable aviation fuel to reduce the carbon footprint of trips. And as you said, right now, there's not universal supply of sustainable aviation fuel to flow into these planes. So we need companies to be able to fund sustainable aviation fuel products and projects and then be able to get credit for them. However, in the current carbon accounting rules of the road, the current carbon accounting board game, there hasn't been that opportunity, that sort of approved, validated opportunity to claim that credit. When actually there's a really easy, in my opinion, there's a really easy and strong analogy with how renewable energy has been treated in that double ledger format of simply saying, okay, here's what we as a company are emitting due to our energy consumption. Here's what we are claiming credit for by virtue of funding more renewable energy purchasing and projects in an additional way. And then applying that to the sustainable aviation fuel space, where we say, yeah, we know we're absolutely traveling. Yes, we are. And here's that first side of the ledger, second side of the ledger, super simple, just stating what got funded and turning that into carbon tons and reporting it that way. So to me, it's actually very simple and has been surprisingly, it strikes me as a ton of amazing people working on these things, but that message was surprisingly complicated to land in the broader ecosystem.
So thanks so much for the wonderful discussion so far. You recently left your role at Microsoft and mentioned to me that you've been doing, and to others, that you've been doing a lot of kind of mindfulness work. Obviously, this is a difficult time to be a sustainability professional, especially in the United States. And I think many of my colleagues, are really, I think we're all trying to find our way through this very strange set of times. So we'd love to hear a little bit about your mindfulness and self-care journey and what that looks like, and how you are keeping your sanity and in the midst of what feels like a very difficult time.
Thanks for asking. I just want to acknowledge that the seriousness of this time on so many levels is very real. And what I've started to realize inside myself is sort of a radical realization that fun and creativity and playfulness are increasingly crucial. And that is something that I experienced over the best times and the best roles I had. And that to me was actually really supported, when I look back, was really supported by the fact that I had a meditation practice throughout the past 20 years. And that I actually also just had a kind of a inherent practice of trying to have fun with my colleagues. So almost every team that I've been part of in the past decade and a half has gone to karaoke together. During the pandemic, we played music videos for each other to cheer each other up. And I'm not saying those things are the panacea. Certainly, we need all the other things that we do, and we need the seriousness. But I think it's just so important to be able to laugh and to step back and reflect, to connect with the beauty of nature, to connect with really why we're motivated to live this life, live this precious life. And I find that then helps me to concentrate better, helps bring my best resilience, be intellectually flexible in all the ways that I hope we can be, and that I know we need to be in order to really solve this issue. So I'm excited about that. I'm being a little bit more just public and sharing with colleagues that I'm doing that, and that I'd love to continue to practice that with more people. And open to outreach on LinkedIn on that count too, because I just think it's so crucial for us to be able to take care of ourselves with fun and friendship and camaraderie in these otherwise really difficult times.
Yeah, and I think one of my observations of folks who work in sustainability and, these kind of cause-driven careers is that it's very difficult to sort of give yourself permission to step back, especially I think when things feel more, every year it's more urgent and more important that we be working effectively and efficiently and really having scale and, impact at scale. And so finding that balance, I think, is a struggle, and giving yourself sort of permission to step back and rest and recharge and, focus on that joy, I think, is really challenging. How have you navigated that in your career?
Well, some people I know, a lot of people I know connect with the beauty of nature and other kind of adrenaline fueled sports through like extreme skiing, extreme sports. That's not really my jam. My jam is more meditation, qigong, which is a form of tai chi, and I'm more of the quiet quiet connection type. I do love to, hike and swim and bike and such, but I really do think that whatever form that takes for you, just know that, I just want to say to the people who are working so hard on this cause and working in these organizations, you're doing great. Just take a beat. Take a beat, take a breath. Don't need to carry the heavy backpack the whole way. Just put it down for a minute and look around, and I think I also just want to give a shout out, and this may be maybe you want to edit this as an answer to a separate question, but I also just get really inspired by some of the smaller but still mighty initiatives that I see, especially what I see in the Pacific Northwest, at least based in the Pacific Northwest, which include the Clean Energy Transition Institute, which is doing incredibly thoughtful work on a small budget, Green Empowerment, which I know Alexia, which develops clean energy and water solutions with communities around the world, including renewable energy projects in Asia, Africa, Latin America, places that are just really, really kind of help us in the United States, at least, to keep perspective on how good often our lives really are. And I think that just staying connected to these organizations has also been a huge source of fun and joy for me, because they're super scrappy, they're super resourceful, and just and have a lot of heart.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that. And I was going to ask you about that specifically because I do think that we often, obviously, a lot of our guests are senior executives in very large multinational companies and, have had senior roles at big bureaucratic institutions, and balancing that kind of large scale impact with the very real impact that smaller organizations have on the ground, I think, is really important because we need it all, right? You need that community based engine to help drive the transformation on the ground. And I love that sort of sense of giving back to those organizations which do incredible work on incredibly small budgets as a way of helping us connect back with the purpose and the reason we do that work. I certainly find that in my board service as well with nonprofit organizations, is just being able to really ground into what they're doing on the ground. What do you think big institutions can learn from some of these smaller or mission-driven organizations that are doing that more local and community-based work?
One of the things that I feel is so reinforcing about connecting with organizations like the Clean Energy Transition Institute and like Green Empowerment and other small but mighty organizations around the world is just how entrepreneurial they are, and how
Mhm.
that spirit and that attitude is exactly what others need to bring to the corporate space. That at the end of the day, yes, corporations as entities are incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, and they're a collection of humans. And I took this spirit when I first joined Microsoft, that Microsoft was like a city that I could organize. As like a community organizer, a political organizer, I could help to organize it and make sense of different stakeholder interests and human interests. And I think that's really what I find is a commonality, is just how entrepreneurial the best change agents are, whether you're in a tiny organization or an enormous company.
Yeah, and just to come back to that, double click on that point about people, like people are people. And, all politics truly are local. And I think, we saw it, you see it at the UN. I mean, it really is just all the way down to local city organizing and engagement with communities. It really is about people making connections with other people and identifying shared goals and objectives and how we can work together on those most effectively. And I love that because I think it helps sort of put in right perspective that no matter where you are in your career, in the work that you're doing, whether it's international or federal or in a big multinational or on the ground, working directly with communities all the time, you can bring your skill set to bear and you can have a huge impact. And we really are going to need to learn how to create space for and honor kind of all of those different levels of engagement and places to contribute, because especially when it comes to adaptation and resilience and really figuring out, okay, what do we do as communities? How do we respond to what is now no longer a distant and ignorable threat to livelihoods, to the way in which we sort of live on this planet, but a very real and present danger and impact, that's going to have to be driven locally, because there really is no other way to help, I think, communities prepare and respond. So I spend a lot of my time in my volunteer time working, with our local energy council here where I live in our rural community, and supporting organizations like Green Empowerment and other locally based nonprofits that do that deep engagement and that long, slow change making at the local level, because it really is just essential to kind of moving this whole agenda forward in a credible way.
Completely. And also, it's so important to remember that climate is a layer across life. It's across all facets of life. And so when we think about the clean energy access or water scarcity issues that communities around the world face increasingly as a result of climate change, as a result of climate impacts, we just see that it becomes part of, for better or worse, the politics of how to manage a community, how to live in a community. And so, again, like you said, politics is local, and also solutions. A lot of the solutions really end up being local.
So I always like to close on, a hopeful note. And I'm just curious, what is getting you out of bed these days, and what are you feeling most hopeful about?
Well, I have to say the laughter and the fun of people bringing a sense of humor to the seriousness of the world, whether it be on any part of the spectrum of politics, but especially folks who wear frog costumes to dance in the street in the face of what feels really serious, and people who step back and kind of take a beat and really look at the issues and take a fresh perspective on things. At the same time, that's obviously an example of some of the political unrest in the United States. I also get excited about the times when we find bipartisan agreement.
Yeah.
I got excited that the sustainable aviation fuel refinery in Montana was approved early on in the Trump administration as a case study of bipartisan success that I think we can really study and unpack for other areas.
Yeah.
Again, those are both about local, in some way, they're about human interaction and local politics. They're also about people's experience and just people being willing to maybe step back and transcend and look beyond what are traditional lines and traditional roles.
Absolutely. Well, Liz, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Navigating Net Zero. And thank you for all the amazing work you do.
You too. Thanks so much.
That's it for this episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be well and keep up the great work.